Hello and welcome to your go-to Detroit Pistons podcast, The Pistons Pulse, co-hosted by me, Bryce Simon of Motor City Hoops and Detroit Bad Boys, a former D1 Hooper, current high school coach, teacher, husband, and father of 3 amazing kids.
And I'm Omari Sanko for the second, Pistons beat writer for the Detroit Free Press.
And of course, we are always blessed to be joined by our producer, Wes Davenport. Before we get going, due to the holidays and everyone's schedule, we did record this episode before the Pistons' Friday game versus Atlanta and Monday game versus the Clippers. But that does not mean we don't have a great episode for you, as we have an amazing guest to look at this Pistons team and organization as a whole, and from more of a front office perspective. Joining us today is former college player, former coach, one-time agent, a man who literally grew up in a basketball family of current NBA front office members, now the senior draft analyst for Basketball News, creator of Babcock Hoops, has his own podcast, The Matt Babcock Show, presented by Title League, as well as countless other NBA and NBA draft-related endeavors. All of that's a long way of saying there's nobody better to come on and talk last year's Piston draft picks and play armchair GM with us than Matt Babcock. Matt, welcome back to the Pistons Pulse.
Bryce, Omari, thanks for having me as always.
Yeah, man, we're excited to get into this. Amari, real quick, where are you at, man? You're always on the road now. You're always traveling. What city we got you in today?
Yeah, I am in the great city of Atlanta, Georgia. Literally, the flight got delayed like an hour. It's, rain and snow everywhere. So in Atlanta, Georgia, staying in the Glen Hotel. So you see this lion behind me. I don't know why this hotel has lions everywhere, but I'm in the Glen Hotel, not too far from the arena. So, yeah, Matt, it's great to see you. It's great to have you on the show.
Likewise.
Yeah, always a pleasure, and this should be a fun one today.
Matt, let's jump right into it. I met you at Summer League this past summer. We got to talk a little about Jaden Ivey, and I know you were a big fan of his coming into the draft. Let's just go back to that. And I know we've had you on before and you've talked about Jaden Ivey, but let's start there and then we'll progress through his rookie season and go from there. Yeah,
no, sounds great. And as you know, I've been a big fan of Jaden's for a while. I think I was higher on him than most NBA draft analysts in the media. And it's, honestly, I'm not really surprised that he's done well individually this year so far.
I guess for you, Matt, what kind of made you higher on Jaden, maybe compared to the consensus? Because he was in that top tier, but it seems like there's almost a half step between him and then you had that top 3 of obviously Chet Holmgren, Jabari Smith Jr., and then Paolo Banchero. Kind of what for you propelled him into that very top tier as well?
Yeah, I think that the biggest things with Jaden that stuck out to me is that his level of burst and athleticism is just so unique. It's just, guys like him don't come around very often. And evaluating him, in that Purdue system and the Big Ten for that matter, I saw, the translatability of his athleticism, really being seamless in the NBA, more floor spacing, more one-on-one action, high pick and roll, really fits his game and his style. And even though, he still has some flaws that he needs to polish up and whatnot, but that athleticism just gives him, star upside in my mind.
So you mentioned the flaws, Matt. What were some of those? Obviously, we've seen some now in the NBA, and obviously it makes sense with him being a rookie. But coming into the NBA, what were some of the things you scouted where like these are definite areas of improvement for Jaden Ivey?
He's interesting because he's an on-ball creator, but he can be pretty loose with his handle. His decision-making can be a little spotty. He's not a traditional point guard by any means, even though I do think he's most effective with the ball in his hands. And so, I think long-term, just increasing his basketball IQ, his feel for the game, and just different reads and decision-making.
Jalen Duren as well. He's played pretty well. I guess where would you? It's a little bit more broad. Kind of where do you think the Pistons rank just as far as their draft class? Obviously being able to get 2 guys in like that lottery system. I'm not sure exactly where you feel on Duren, but I think a lot of Pistons fans have been very happy with what they've seen from that duo through 35 games or so.
I think they did really well in the draft. I got interviewed after the draft by a number of different outlets, and they're one of the teams that I said, I thought they came out of there with an A, and getting Ivey at where they did, and Duren, who's a younger player with upside. I thought it was a great draft for them. And as far as my feelings on Jalen, I've been following him since he was in high school, and obviously he reclassified last year to be a freshman at Memphis early, and there were some concerns with his his maturity a little bit. He had somewhat of a selective motor, but talent wise, he was big time. His physical tools. The guy, even though he was a young freshman last year, already was just so physically developed and had sort of a surprising skill set for a guy of his stature. And I think it was more of just he needed time to get groomed and kind of grow up a little bit.
We talked on this podcast about Jalen Duren, or I did. I don't think Omari ever agreed with me, I guess, but I talked about him possibly spending some time in the G League just because he was so young. At that time, the Pistons roster was filled with bigs, and I just thought I wanted him to get the usage. And I know we'll talk about this a little bit later when we talk about everything as a whole, making sure these guys are getting those in-game reps. Are you surprised at all that he's never spent any time in the G League, was immediately getting minutes off the bench, and now has worked his way into the starting lineup? Like, based off what you had seen, did you see that out of him this early in his rookie season?
With him, it really depended on where he was selected. I mean, I think this would have gone a lot differently if he had gone to a number of other teams. Obviously, Detroit's in more of a rebuild mode. I think they could handle playing young guys and letting them work through their kinks a little bit, which I personally think is a benefit for Jalen. Like you mentioned, I mean, guys, in order for them to develop properly, they need to be on the floor, whether it's in the NBA, the G League, or wherever. That there's only so much progress you can make, doing individual workouts and just working, outside the bright lights. And so it seems like it's worked out well for him because they are playing him, I think, enough to where he is able to grow.
What do you see as sort of the archetype for him? I think a lot of comparisons are thrown out, but at the end of the day, you just don't see a lot of bigs with his athleticism that also, you kind of see the passing upside. He had 4 assists last night. Just what player do you see him sort of occupying? What mode do you see him occupying if he develops into, close to his ceiling?
I don't know if I necessarily have a good comp for him specifically, but as far as his style of play, I mean, I think his game can be relatively simple, while still being effective and valuable for the Pistons. Physicality, blue collar, type stuff of, setting screens, rebounds, rim running. And as you mentioned, he is more skilled than one might think initially. I mean, I noticed his passing ability, even when he was in high school. He's shown the ability of having a decent touch. I mean, I think he's got, room for growth. Probably a lot of it is confidence development as far as outside shooting. But I do think he's capable of shooting it out, an open shot at a decent range. But I think big men outside of the guys that are Joel Embiid and Nikola Jokic really can just be play a simple role and just kind of master their role.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of comparisons to Dwight Howard and, just because of the body type probably more than anything and the athleticism and the things he's able to do. I sometimes I don't get frustrated with that because obviously Dwight Howard was incredible, but I don't want people to miss on some of the things you're talking about. The passing, a developing mid-range jumper over maybe a few years, an ability to possibly play some switch coverage. Obviously, he's going to be more of a drop coverage big. I'm not saying he's going to end up being like Bam Adebayo or Nikola Jokic. Like those, I'm not saying it's that skill, but I don't want him. I've always been worried about him getting pigeonholed into just being uber athletic and big and strong. And so that's why I don't always love the Dwight Howard comparison. Do you think those skill sets are real and developing, are going to happen for him?
I do think they're real. I'm not sure how important they are. I mean, if you're looking at it from an organizational standpoint with the Pistons, I mean, I don't know if I necessarily would need, to really emphasize your offense utilizing his passing or shooting abilities or just overall skill set. It's kind of just a nice bonus. I do think he can play a Dwight Howard type of game. Also keep in mind, Dwight Howard, how he made his name was in a different era of basketball, right? I mean, it was still a lot of like low post isolation, stuff like that. And I think, where, as Dwight aged, the role he kind of fell into, I think Jalen's got a chance of sort of, like I said, mastering that type of role where it's pretty simple basketball. Big, the traditional big men these days, you have to do, X, Y, and Z, but you need to do it well. And then obviously the biggest difference is on the defensive end. He needs to make sure that he's able to move his feet and not kind of get lost in space and that sort of thing. And, even if they are playing some level of drop coverage, you don't want it to be extreme because then you're just too vulnerable. So it's still kind of is the same concepts of being somewhat versatile, even though he's a really big guy.
I want to go back to Jaden Ivey, and you mentioned earlier, which me and Bryce both agree with. He's not a traditional point guard. He's more of, he's not an off-ball guard either. He needs the ball, but he's not necessarily the guy you want to be, like your lead playmaker, I guess, to say. How do you sort of build around a guy like that? The Pistons obviously have Cade, which not this season, but ideally in the future, take some of that playmaking off of him. But I guess, how do you imagine a roster that kind of maximizes what Jaden Ivey can do, given that him getting downhill is such a game-changing force, but you still have to kind of take care of the things that he can't do as well.
With Cade and Jaden, when they're on the floor together, I mean, I think there is room for more than one creator, and I think both are at a point. I mean, they're both still really young, right? But I do think they're at a point where outside shooting, even though it's not their strength, it's not broken either. And I think naturally they'll improve to where they both can play on the ball, off the ball, kind of find a nice balance, and that'll probably be the coach's biggest juggling act of figuring out how do you utilize both players at that level properly. But I do think I see it as an advantage for the Pistons organization of having, two guys that can create, that are versatile. And I mean, especially Cade, I mean, with his size, he essentially can play the 1, 2, or 3. So I think, even with this high lottery pick coming, which I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, you really have a lot of lineup flexibility and a lot of flexibility with what kind of sets and what kind of actions you're trying to run.
Matt, I know the answer to this because you and I have talked about this, but for our listeners, what do you think the ceiling is for Jaden Ivey? I'm not going to ask for a comp or anything like that, but, and I know it's all relative, like there's a percentage chance that he actually reaches a ceiling, but like a realistic, like what do you kind of envision Jaden Ivey being in the league?
If he keeps developing and it all clicks, I'm expecting him to be a perennial all-star. I mean, I think his upside is that high, and that's why I was surprised he got to the point in the draft that he did. Even though I really like those other top players a lot. I just the upside, the upside's there in my mind.
Let's shift to another primary ball handler for this team, and that's Killian Hayes. And obviously, he's played a lot better over the last month. The last 3 games have been a little shaky, so, he's hitting a little bit of adversity here. But I want to go back to 2020 when he got drafted, Matt. I don't know how much you scouted him specifically, but I know you were doing that back then. What was kind of the scouting report on him? What were your thoughts on him? And maybe what has surprised you about the struggles through his career so far?
No, I've scouted him for a long time. I mean, I've watched him in Paris or in France a number of times in person. And I was always intrigued with his playmaking ability. I think the biggest struggle, and it was something that held me back on him a little bit, was the lack of quickness, which I think's been one of his biggest problems in the NBA. He's not really getting by people regularly. And then he struggled with confidence. I mean, he struggled earlier, and it seems like he kind of got in quicksand from a mental, confidence standpoint, which if you're not confident, I mean, good luck hitting shots against NBA defenders. Right. And so, he just kind of got into a funk, and it's nice to see that he's growing out of it. I don't necessarily think that he has star potential, but I mean, if he's playing on, with higher confidence and he's hitting shots, I think he's a very serviceable guy, like on a good team, possibly being like a good rotation guy that could, be a fringe starter possibly.
Did you buy into his upside as a shooter? Because he did not knock down a lot of threes when he was overseas, but I think the free throw percentage was always there, and the mechanics were always good enough, and I think a lot of people could see the outlines of him becoming a decent shooter as his career went on. And he's been red hot from mid-range. He's been good from 3, kind of toned off a little bit now, but it took a while for the shooting to come, but it has come. Is that something that you saw, coming from him eventually?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't think he was a totally pure shooter, but I didn't think it was going to be a problem either. And so, I mean, his early struggles did surprise me, even though I had somewhat, question marks with the lack of quickness and whatnot. I mean, I was a bit surprised that he struggled as much as he did early. And but long term, yeah, I think mechanics wise, I think he's fine. I think with him, it's mostly a confidence type thing.
You've been an agent for prospects. You played at a high level. You've been around the game your entire life. How much is confidence an issue for NBA players? Because it's kind of strange to hear, right? Like a guy that's as talented as Killian Hayes, they struggle to have confidence, but it seems like a very, very real thing with him going back to when you scouted him. And it's definitely been a real thing in his time in Detroit. Is that fairly common with NBA guys?
Oh, for sure. I mean, confidence is everything, especially in basketball, and especially with perimeter players that are, depend on skills, right? So, I mean, ball handling, passing, shooting. I mean, if you're not feeling good about yourself, it's hard to maximize your talent and shooting, especially. I mean, if you're not feeling good about yourself and you're not able to visualize yourself making shots, I mean, good luck. It's just that's a hard hurdle to get over. One
thing about that draft is that really the top 15 wasn't that good, and then really the top 10 specifically was not great. One thing I talked to Duren about a couple of weeks ago was just Killian came in from overseas, had a very shortened training camp just because of the nature of the pandemic. A lot of guys' workouts over that off season were kind of disrupted, just from, lack of gym access in some ways and all sorts of other things. And, Killian just had a very irregular kind of start to his career, especially with the hip injury. Do you think that could be a factor just in this draft class as a whole? Because, like one thing I've, talked to fans or just anyone else about is that, Killian's 7th pick, maybe have high hopes, but in that draft, that's not maybe your traditional 7th pick. I think after the top 2 or 3 picks, it was pretty much wide open as far as how different teams evaluated a lot of those guys.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think that, the higher the pick, higher the actual number, the more pressure there is on the player and the team for that player to succeed. But at the end of the day, I mean, these teams need to pick somebody, right? And so, I definitely think that is somewhat of a factor as far as the built-in pressure and expectations.
Matt, before we really kind of put you in the GM chair and talk about this organization as a whole, I want to ask about one more specific player in that same draft class, and that's Isaiah Stewart. And as we were talking this week and leading up to this, you gave some insight onto Isaiah and his high school film and what he was doing, or maybe you watched him in person, but just him as a high school player. And now that we're seeing him shoot the 3 with the Detroit Pistons, what were your thoughts on him coming out of high school after 1 year at Washington? Because I think one thing a lot of Pistons fans don't realize, he was a top 5 ESPN recruit in that high school recruiting class. So we're talking about a big time talent in Isaiah Stewart coming out.
I've watched Isaiah for years, and I remember this was before he even committed to Washington. The first time I saw him was, I believe, was at the Nike Academy in LA. I mean, that was 5 years ago now, and right off the bat, I mean, just his physicality and his motor jump out. I mean, he's been special. I think it's just, how he's built. He's just a tough guy that's willing and able to run through a brick wall. And so, I loved his toughness right off the bat. And I saw the shooting potential even back then, even though that's not been what his label has been. He had a really nice touch, a tight release, really good rotation. I did think he was going to develop into a player that could stretch the floor. So I'm not surprised that he's shooting the ball a little bit right now. And then at Washington, I think his team wasn't very good. Their guard play was absolutely horrible his freshman year there. His toughness, I think, rang through, but didn't do much on the perimeter. And I think a lot of people were held back on him. One, because, I mean, the trend of big, traditional big men, the value just dying, I think hurt him across the board with people. I just, his toughness and willing to do whatever it takes to win and make things happen. I just had so much confidence in him that he would be able to figure it out to be a good NBA player. So I was really, really much higher on him than most people were.
Compared to college, Isaiah's role in the NBA has been pretty significantly different. I mean, of course, he defended in a zone at Washington, which, you're not going to do as much in the NBA, but, he's mostly post-oriented. He wasn't defending on the perimeter as much. He has some mid-range jumpers here and there, but he's been almost a full-time forward this season. He's taken like 4 threes a game, and, he didn't take very many in college at all. How often have you seen, just in 3 years, a big man kind of come into the NBA and almost change their entire profile as a player? Because his trajectory so far, I think, has been really unique for him to do that in such a short amount of time.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think every year we talk about it more and more internally with my colleagues of, big men, like how do they translate? I mean, we all are aware that the value of the traditional big men is it's not dead, but it's lost significant value, right? And so with Isaiah, I mean, it's kind of one of those deals where it's like, hey, adapt or die, right? And that goes back to like the character and his approach of, hey, I had confidence that this kid would be able to figure it out and find a way of being an effective NBA player. And he's done it. I mean, I think, right now we're looking at guys like, 2 of the top players in college basketball with Drew Timme and Oscar Tshiebwe. And even though they're different style of players, they're big men that probably would have held a lot more value in the league 15, 20 years ago. Now we're trying to figure out, okay, with Oscar Tshiebwe specifically, he's kind of like Isaiah Stewart, right? This is a big physical guy that's, super high character. It's tough. It's all, the juggling act type of deal. But I think Isaiah is sort of the recent, poster child as far as a guy like, hey, let's not discredit these guys that have that secret sauce, if you will, right? I mean, Isaiah certainly has it. I mean, I think he's a culture setter, right? I mean, that's exactly the guy. Troy comes in, brings in Isaiah, and based off Troy's press conference when he got hired, I mean, it made perfect sense, right? I mean, he wants toughness, he wants to bring back the whole bad boys type persona, and that's Isaiah Stewart in a nutshell.
All right, speaking of Troy Weaver, we're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to talk to Matt and break this organization down, the moves that have been made, the moves that are coming at the deadline, the moves that are coming in the offseason. And with all of his front office expertise, he's going to give us some insight into what he thinks the Pistons should be doing.
Take a listen to this.
So this sign that I have says, on today's episode of America, guns have more rights than women.
That's a clip from On the Line, a weekly podcast produced by the Detroit Free Press. I'm the host, Kerry Jr. II, and you're getting a glimpse into the types of stories we cover. The latest in news, culture, and everyday life. We're sifting through the news to give you what's important and hearing what you've got to say about it.
There was this huge disinvestment in the city of Detroit. And now, all of a sudden, it's cool to be here. So now you're going to come and take what we got.
So check out On the Line every Friday, wherever you listen to podcasts.
All right, we're back with segment 2, and we're going to play a game, really a couple games of armchair GM here. And we're going to put Matt in the GM seat. And I want to lead off with the player that probably will generate the most trade interest for the Pistons through the trade deadline, and that's Bojan Bogdanovic, who's having a really, even by his standards, a pretty strong overall offensive season. The Pistons extended him an extra 2 years back toward the beginning of this season, but I think the debate right now is, the Pistons are still bad, obviously, without Cade. Do you keep him and make a decision on him later on, or do you sort of still high on him now? And I'm just curious, Matt, what your approach would be for him, with this trade deadline approaching a couple months from now.
The way I see this is there's not necessarily one right way of building a team, or running a team, building a team, and sort of what the timeline is as far as to win. For me, from the outside looking on in with the Pistons, I would stay on rebuild mode. I think they've got a nice core unit of young players, and they need to prioritize continuing to develop them individually and collectively. And so with that said, I mean, Bogdanovic is not part of their long-term plans, nor should he, right? He's a really effective player, but I mean, he's how old is he now? In his early 30s?
33 or 34.
33.
Right. So, I mean, I would look to trade him, possibly, do some kind of like salary dump where you get an expiring contract and get some assets, maybe a pick or two. That would be my approach. And also, with that mindset of trying to trim down the salary cap. So you kind of do the Sam Presti type approach of absorbing bad contracts to gain more assets. Because I think they need to kind of double down on, like, hey, we're a young team that's probably 2-3 years away from even scratching the surface of their prime as a core. So long story short, I think I would aggressively look at options of moving him to bring some assets back.
Matt, whenever we were talking about this, the very first thing you told me was like, man, Bojan's taking the most field goal attempts on the team. And I think that kind of stood out to you. Why did that surprise you? And I don't want to say concern you, but why was that kind of a big takeaway for you that, Cade was obviously averaging the most before the injury, but that Bojan was taking the majority of the field goal attempts for this team? What stood out to you with that?
Obviously you guys watch this team a lot more than I do, but again, looking from the outside looking on in, Saddiq Bey's regressed a little bit shooting wise, at least, right?
Yep.
And I mean, how much is the Bogdanovic factored into that? I mean, is he playing as with much confidence because he's not in quite as big a role? And I'm just using that as one example, but my priorities would be, our young guys that we're invested in long term that we want to develop. They need to be put in roles where they're going to thrive and they're going to be able to build confidence. And so, having a guy like Bogdanovic who is being so effective individually, might be holding these guys back a little bit. That's and kind of what you're talking about too with Jalen Duren is the usage. I mean, the guys need usage to learn and grow.
Sort of, where is your philosophy on just having veterans with, like young teams like the Pistons who are learning how to win? You have a guy in Bojan who's been in some really good situations with the Utah Jazz. Like the Pacers were still pretty good when he was with Indiana. Of course, he's a guy that kind of needs the ball, and there are veterans who probably don't need that type of usage. But I guess where do you fall in just having a guy like that with the team who could ideally just kind of show through example how to play winning basketball.
A young rebuilding team does need to have a veteran presence. I think it needs to be somewhat of a case by case. As far as what type of players or what level you're expecting from them. I think with this team, you don't want a ball dominant guy, because you've got some players that need the ball. I mean, with Cade and Jaden and Sadiq's not ball dominant, but I'd like to see him get more shots, and so having another shooter out there that plays, I guess a similar style, a little bit, is something I would look to avoid. I mean, with this team, I think I would like I mentioned, trim down the cap to create space to possibly absorb bad contracts where you get additional picks and kind of be more flexible with how you build your team moving forward, and then just getting some vets that you're not really dependent on to play a whole lot of minutes or make a lot happen. Just be more of a veteran presence in the locker room, and if you need spot minutes or injuries and you need depth, guys that are fully capable of producing, but you're not necessarily dependent on them. You sort of use your young core unit to grow as a group.
Another vet that's in a similar situation as Bojan is Alec Burks. He's on a club option for $10 million next year. A really good, number for a guy like Alec Burks. I think the last time he's top 10 in scoring off the bench. So he's having a good season. He does make a lot of his threes unassisted. So another guy, I don't know that he demands the ball as much as Bojan, but he's playing in the second unit right now with Sadiq Bey, who's been moved back there. And you watch the second unit play and he's taking the shots, or Marvin Bagley's taking the shots, and it's not Sadiq. So, someone like Alec Burks, are you of the same mindset of, hey, you probably need to see if you can trade him, let the contract expire, because right now he's kind of taking some usage from the young guys?
Personally, I would probably go very aggressive on the rebuild approach as far as trimming down those contracts. And Alex is in a similar situation as Bogdanovich is. He's still got a lot left in the tank, right? And I'm sure he's still got goals of his own that he's wanting to accomplish. And if I was representing Alex, I'd tell him to get out of town and go play for a winner instead of being a babysitter, right? But another thing to keep in mind is, okay, if there's idea that there's any struggles with managing the minutes and opportunities right now, Cade's out and they're gonna be adding 2 other high picks at least, right? And that's not even considering they were to take my approach and trade Bogdanovich, try and get another pick, right? And so you're gonna be adding at least 2 more young players, and so I would be very careful of not having a log jam. And I'm sure Pistons fans, like any fan base, want their team to win, want them to be good, probably are impatient to a certain extent, right? But I do think the best thing for the franchise would be prioritizing the long term, since they have such a great core, young core unit.
Omari, are the Pistons fans a little impatient right now? How do you feel about that? Was Matt spot on with that?
Yes, absolutely spot on. It's funny because they played there, like we're recording this, for people listening on Thursday, the day before they played the Hawks on Friday. And they had a really bad loss to the Sixers last night. And it was a really bad loss. It was the worst loss of the season. They had 22 turnovers, probably 14 of those were turnovers you see in middle school games, and not turnovers you see in the NBA too much. 3 were in the backcourt, right after the inbounds. And, I just kind of opened discussion on Twitter. I don't see anybody tweeting about this game. It's just the beat writers. Y'all good. And fans were just absolutely not. We are absolutely sick of this rebuild and we're ready to see some winning. Which is why this feels like, even if it could be a quiet deadline for the Pistons, because I do think that they want to take steps toward winning next season, significant steps toward winning. You're at a point now where you have 50 games left, and the fan base is I don't know how much longer we can do this. But that kind of brings me to the next question. You kind of look at this roster and you see guys like Nerlens Noel, who's not getting a lot of minutes because they're prioritizing the development of Jalen Duren, and Corey Joseph, he looked like he was going to not come off the bench at all last night until it became a blowout. Do you see value for those types of guys, just veterans who are probably more so bench pieces, but obviously can kind of shore up depth for teams that want to make deep runs? Do you see any assets that the Pistons could get for guys like that?
Yeah, possibly. I think Corey's still very much a serviceable backup. And it's really, I think, case by case with each guy. Where are their priorities at personally? What is Troy, what kind of conversations is Troy having with their agents, that sort of thing. And that's where, being an armchair general manager is challenging, because there's so much that goes on behind the scenes as far as communicating with the player, communicating with his circle, making sure you're on the same page, because, oftentimes, the public might think, hey, this guy's washed up, he doesn't want to play. The player doesn't think that, though. And so if you don't get a veteran to buy into a role like that, now all of a sudden you're not only having to like babysit and groom all these young guys, you're having to manage all these aging stars too. And it very quickly could become just a total zoo for a general manager, head coach, coaching staff, and everybody involved.
Matt, can we just talk in general here for a second? Because you brought up Troy and the relationships. And one thing I've been impressed, again, just somebody from the outside, like I felt like he took care of Derrick Rose whenever he traded him to the Knicks. Because personally, I thought that's probably where Derrick wanted to go. He bought out Blake Griffin. He's made some other moves where you felt like it was some relationship-based decisions and making those connections, kind of taking care of guys without really hindering the organization. Can you just speak to how important that is? You know, you were on the other side of that as an agent at one point. You know, as an agent, what would that mean to you that, you know, have a GM that kind of takes care of your guy? Are you more inclined then, hey, you have another guy that comes up for free agency? Well, now that, you know, Troy Weaver and the Pistons are, you know, maybe higher on the list, is that a real reality in the NBA?
I think every general manager, every team exec looks at it a little bit differently. For me personally, I've had this debate with some NBA guys, and it's not exactly the same thing, but it relates to it. Is with the pre-draft process, some teams will bring these players in and they'll drill the heck out of them. They'll put them through these workouts that are so impossible, and really just really test them, their mental toughness and whatnot. Which I understand why, but to me, I would look at it from a little bit of a different angle as far as, hey, we want this to be an appealing place for players. Even if we're not going to draft this player, we might want to sign him in a few years, right? And so, I think, having some courtship, even if there's not an imminent opportunity of kind of creating this presence that is well thought of, I do think is really important. And so taking care of veterans that have sort of earned to be treated with respect, I think that common decency is not only the right thing to do. I think long term it's the right way of running a team. Just to maximize your opportunities as well.
One thing Troy has always talked about since he was hired is just like bringing the right people into the organization. And, I think sort of the baseline behind that is not just wanting to have like a high character program, right? But having people who are sort of in for the long haul, because when you're in the rebuild, you're going to lose a lot of games, as the Pistons have. They have the worst record in the NBA. And you just sort of need, people who can buy in. And I think some of the motivation for the veterans as well is, if a guy's no longer bought in, right, then you want to find a good situation for them and sort of keep things intact. But you mentioned how things can kind of become a zoo really quickly. How much do you think rebuilds can sort of be, or maybe the timeline of rebuilds could be affected by how content everybody is in the locker room, right? Like if you have young guys who are like, well, no, I want to win. Like how much can that maybe speed things up and lead a team to say, well, now it's time to win, right? Like even if it's not the right time from a skill standpoint, it's the right time just from a patience standpoint.
There's so many thoughts just ran through my head when you brought that up, and there's so many different layers to manage with a rebuild, and a lot of things that even just my dad and uncles have gone through this a number of times, and one thing that's regularly been said is, if you're going to do a rebuild, make sure you have the job security to do it, right? Because it's like people, everybody's, acts like it's a great idea at the beginning, but pretty soon the owners, the fan base, everybody's, coming at your neck, right? So it was really nice to see that Troy got that extension, because I do think he's doing it right. And not that every move he's made is panned out as well as he hoped it would, but it's not realistic to think that a general manager, everything they do will be absolutely perfection, right? But they've got this great core unit. I'm hoping they stay the course, because I think I'm being a little repetitive here, but I think going win now mode, I think it's premature. I think they're a year or so away from flipping the switch, and maybe even longer than that. And let's see who they get in this this next draft, because they got a big one coming.
I want to ask about Coach Casey, and not specific to him, I guess, but one thing that I think Omari and I preach is that Coach Casey's very well respected. Coach Casey does a really good job turning these young players into professionals, teaching them the way of the NBA. Are we overstating that? Like, are we giving him too much credit? Like, no, their agents are teaching him that, or they're going to figure it out? Or is like that some real value that the Pistons have a coach like Coach Casey that sees the importance of that and is helping Killian Hayes grow and Sadiq grow and Jaden Ivey grow? Like, what is the value of that, Matt?
For me, I mean, again, I think you'll have a different answer depending on who you ask. With me, I think it's very valuable, especially for this group. Most of these guys are still kids, right? They should still be in college. And I think a lot of the priorities that an athletic director should look at when hiring a coach are pretty different typically for an owner or general manager looking to hire a coach for an NBA team, but not when you've got a young rebuilding team. These are young guys that still need to be molded into men. And Dwayne Casey is a high character, old school guy. And I think he's the right type of personality and has the right level of experience to help young guys, become professionals. And so, I think as they, as this team, develops and becomes probably a contender in the next couple of years, 2-3 years, I think the priorities of what Coach Casey will need to look at and sort of prioritize is going to change. I mean, things a lot more of an emphasis on the technical part of the game. I mean, right now you're just everything's about development and growth. And again, it's at a certain point. I'm not sure exactly when it's going to be. You need to flip the switch a little bit. Now it's going to be like, all right, we've got you to a certain point. Now we need to maximize on this talent that we've developed.
It's not a hot take to say that coaches in the NBA, I think when you sort of prioritize the keys to like any rebuild or success, a lot of times the coach is one of the first people to go. And Casey's pretty unique in the sense that he was hired to coach a team led by, Blake Griffin, expected to be the playoffs, and then things kind of go downhill rapidly. And now, he's in his third year under a GM that did not hire him. Typically when, GMs come in, they, put their stamp on the team. Trey did that with the roster, he did that with the front office. He did not do that with the coach. He kept Dwayne Casey. He allowed Dwayne Casey to do assistants and everything last summer. I guess as his rebuild goes on, do you see value in allowing Dwayne to get to the point where this team's good enough and you give him the chance to coach that roster? Because I think more and more you kind of see sentiment from the fan base that, we need a new voice, this and that. And I think that the NBA typically has a culture of, when you want to make a statement, you fire the coach, right? The Pistons thus far have been behind Dwayne Casey to give him a chance to coach this team. Do you think that Dwayne is the guy that should be allowed to kind of see this team until you get to the points where you want to see them win more? I
mean, I think the NBA is so competitive from every angle. Everybody's being evaluated pretty much every day, whether it be the general manager, the coach, the players, everyone. I will say this, and it's more of a general statement, and I've had debates with this with some friends of, I think one thing that I think teams do, and I'm going a little off course, but I bear with me, is with the G League, teams will hire young coaches to run it and use it as a developmental opportunity for coaches. I think it is the most backwards concept ever. Like, why would you want an inexperienced guy developing young players? I would look at the opposite. I would want a veteran guy that's been there, that's done that. You don't want the blind leading the blind. You want somebody to show them the way, right? Yeah. And so I would be more open to hiring somebody that's proven to be technically good and maybe in more have less experience as a head coach and being a leader with a more experienced team. With a young team, I would want a guy like Dwayne Casey leading them. At the point that they need to flip the switch, naturally, I think they'll go back to the drawing board and evaluate everything they have, including Dwayne Casey, right? But for the time being, I think he's the guy to take them to that point.
Final question, and then we'll go to a short break and then talk NBA draft stuff for the first time. So this is the first time we're really talking Victor, Scoot, and all that, Matt. So it's kind of exciting, and it's time. It's time now, as Omari's mentioned, the Pistons have lost a lot, and it's time to talk about those guys. But I just want to make sure I give you a chance to clarify, and put a bow on the off-season approach. So it's move on from Boyan, Burks, Noel, only bring in vets. That would open up a lot of cap space, Matt. What would you do with that cap space this summer? I assume it's not chase a star or something like that. It's just to do what with that cap space?
First, just kind of give you a few little points of basic understanding of the cap, how it works and whatnot. So next season, the cap will be $134 million. But the team will need to pay a minimum of salaries out. I think 90% of the total cap. So I think comes out as like $120 million. The contracts that the Pistons have in place outside of the veterans you just mentioned are all rookie scale contracts, right? And so they don't even come close to hitting the minimum. Yeah. So, we're talking about if they were to, say Troy would follow a plan that I proposed, right? You're looking at $60+ million in cap room, right? And no, I don't think they should go after the biggest free agents. I think it would be counterintuitive as far as what they're trying to do with this rebuild. I would aggressively look. I mean, Sam Presti's done this a lot, Troy's old boss in OKC, where he absorbs bad expiring contracts and takes picks with them. And I would stockpile as much as I possibly could, taking that approach. And if you end up in a tough spot where you're not getting close to the minimum salaries, I would go do the Philly JJ Redick deal, where you overpay a veteran on a 1-year deal. You get the exact guy you want. You overpay him, but you pretty much overpay him to take a role that fits exactly what you're trying to do. And so, I mean, a lot of it is you kind of need to go through the process and see what's available out there. I mean, it's easy to say, hey, we're going to trade Bogdanovich for X, Y, and Z. Somebody else got to agree to that, though, right? So, but I do think that that's the approach I would take to see explore options and see what's out there. But we will see what Troy decides to do, right?
And a lot of that may be dependent on where the Pistons land in the draft. So after this short break, Omari, we are going to ask Matt who he would take with the number 1 pick if he were the GM of the Detroit Pistons, and then go down the line to number 2, 3, 4, and 5.
All right, hey, Carlos, just a quick idea. How about if I say, hey, this is Sean Windsor, and you say, hey, this is Carlos Morales, and I'll go, and then we'll go back. You want to try that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Hey, this is Sean Windsor.
And this is Carlos Morales.
And we are the team behind Free Press Sports with Carlos and Sean, where we are going to talk about, you guessed it, sports, but lots of other stuff. Like what, Carlos?
Oh, we're going to talk about your favorite subject, Sean, food. Probably more food. Arts, culture, sports, TV, movies, you name it. If it's happened in Detroit, we're going to talk about it.
And sometimes we're going to have guests in who obviously know a lot more than we do about just about everything. But we're going to have some Free Press journalists to talk about big stories, folks from the sports world. We're going to be out every Thursday. You can find this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts. We hope you'll join us.
All right, we're back with segment 3, and as Bryce mentioned earlier, we're doing our first real draft segment of the season, and then we could thank the Pistons, for that 20-point loss against the Sixers for that, because we kind of need to flip through the script a little bit and speed some things up. This is the Wemby draft. I think many analysts would say that Wemby is the no-brainer first overall pick, and I think people who have been following this draft know why, but it's not too often you see, or anytime you see 7'4" guys with the guard skills that he has. But I say that because I assume you're going to say Wemby number 1, but I also don't know exactly how your draft list is playing out right now. So who would you take number 1? And if it's not Wemby, then who would that be?
Well, first of all, it's draft season all year for me. So this is nice when people want to turn the page and kind of step into my area. So thank you for that. And I've got a really hot take here. No, I'm just kidding. I would take Victor.
Okay. Matt, we were definitely putting that part on Twitter if that's where we went with this.
That was a record scratch.
Right. No, I'm just messing with you guys. Yeah, Victor's unbelievable. I was at those 2 games in Vegas where he and Scoot went head to head, and I've never seen a prospect like him. I played against LeBron in high school. I'm a couple years older than LeBron. Obviously, he was incredible. But I mean, those are the 2 best high school level players. Obviously, Victor's not in high school, but 17, 18-year-olds that I've ever seen. And I think specifically with Detroit, what's great about what they have in place now is they've got players with upside, but a lot of versatility too. I think already they've got lineup flexibility. And with Victor, I mean, this guy is essentially like a 7'4", 7'5", positionless, skilled guy. And I mean, I'm just thinking about all the different lineups you could throw out within one game. I mean, it's just absolutely nuts. I mean, it's Bryce, we talked about this earlier. I mean, I wouldn't even be surprised if you put out a lineup at certain points where you've got Victor, Isaiah, and Jalen all playing together, which is just stupid, right? Clear cut. You got essentially anybody that gets the first pick's got to take Victor, unless barring some kind of crazy circumstance where medical issues or something along those lines. But I mean, my full expectation is that Victor will be the number 1 pick, regardless of who gets it.
Generational is thrown around a lot. I don't think it's should be used as much as it is. I feel pretty comfortable saying Victor is generational. Do you think that that's a time, or he's the player that we can use that term with because he is a 7'5" guy that can handle, shoot, and play defense? Or is it still too much to say that?
No, I think it's fair to say he's a generational talent or a generational prospect.
Yeah.
As long as that it's understood that that's not a finished product. There's certain things that need to happen for these guys to become what you want them to. I mean, just like we were talking about with these other young guys. I mean, with Jaden Ivey, like I have a lot of confidence in Jaden. Is he absolutely going to get there? Like, I don't know. I mean, he's got to take care of business. Like things need to go a certain way. And the same goes for Victor. I mean, he's not a surefire NBA superstar. If I were to bet on it, yeah, I think he's got as good a chance or better than any player I've ever seen. But yeah, no, I mean, there's always risk when you're drafting an 18, 19 or 20-year-old, because there's a big gap between what they are and what you want them to be.
As we've talked about, Wemby is a once in a generation prospect, of his size, his defensive instincts, the way he shoots it, the way he handles it. He kind of plays like a weird cross of like Rudy Gobert and, like Dirk maybe. But I guess if a guy like that were to not live up to his ceiling, sort of what would those reasons be? Because I know one thing that some analysts have had concerns about, or you just talk to people around the league, is maybe durability, given just guys that tall often do have some durability issues. Do you see those problems with him potentially being an issue? And is there anything else that kind of points out as a red flag for you?
Yeah, I mean, the physical part of it is really the only issue I have. I mean, I think the intel adds up. I mean, he's supposed to be a very mature, polished kid. Skill set wise, I mean, he's already on such a high level. I mean, he's hitting these one-footed floating NBA three. I mean, I feel like I'm like watching a video game, watching the film about this guy. Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think it's all going to come down. I mean, the one thing that I think is interesting is, we talk about this a lot with my guys, is unique body types often lead to unique issues with their bodies. And Wemby's got about as unique a body as we've maybe ever seen, right? I mean, he's 7'5", 8 foot wingspan, like essentially perimeter player. And so I think the medical screening process is going to be important. And this is one hypothetical scenario: is what if his agent doesn't let him do physicals? I mean, I think certain owners, certain medical teams will feel differently about investing millions and millions of dollars without having, having the medical information. I mean, it's like, hey, I'm gonna go buy this Rolls Royce, but I'm not going to, and it's used, but I'm not going to show you the Carfax, right? And so I think different people looked at that situation differently, and that's a real scenario. I mean, that might happen.
That happened with Chet a little bit, right? Like it may have been strategic by Chet's team, but Chet reportedly did hold his medicals from a couple teams, correct?
Yeah, I think he held it from most teams, okay. And I don't think it was released. And I don't know this for certain, but I don't think it was released until right before the draft. But yeah, no, I mean that kind of stuff happens behind the scenes quite a bit, and Victor's got enough leverage. I mean, say the team that gets number 1 pick or the number 2 pick, the agents don't like those teams for whatever reason. They might try and power play to have them slip. I mean, probably not, but it's possible.
All right, real quick before we go to number 2, because I know there are some other really exciting guys in this draft. Compare Chet and Wemby for those fans that, not everybody gets access to Metropolitan 92 games. And so not everybody has seen him other than the highlights. So, real fans who really want to know, but I think a lot of times it's like, oh, we just saw Chet last year. This is just a 7'5" version of Chet. Can you compare those two guys for the listeners?
Well, I mean, I think they're very similar. The biggest difference for me is that I think Victor has a better body than Chet. I mean, they're both extremely thin, but Victor already has some definition in his arms. He looks like he's got a frame that probably can add some more functional weight, whereas Chet, I think he's just got one of those body types that's not going to add much weight ever. And regardless of what he does, and so that naturally gives Victor more upside just for the idea of his body's going to improve, and then from a skill set standpoint, I mean, a 7'5" version of Chet is really damn good. So I mean, it's because Chet is already a unicorn, right? I mean, he's a 7 foot plus guy that's doing stuff off the dribble, blocking shots left and right, shooting threes, and so yeah, essentially Victor is Chet Holmgren. He's just like sort of a rich man's version of him. But yeah, I mean, very very similar in style of play. I do think Victor does even a little bit more off the dribble, a little bit more versatile as a shooter. But it's the same idea. I mean, these guys are just absolute unicorns as prospects.
I was going to say Wemby has a little bit more wiggle than Chet, which is a really funny, thing to say about a guy who's 7'5", but he has wiggle. He does have a little more wiggle than Chet.
No, you're right. I mean, it very similar, but everything's similar. It's just I think Victor's a little bit better at everything than Chet, which is which is pretty awesome, to be honest.
You look at that number 2 pick, and I think again, this is a unique draft, and that the 1 and 2 are pretty clear cut. Which really is, I guess, is similar in a way to the 2019 draft of John and Zion, where those were declared number 1 and 2. But Scoot Henderson, he hasn't played in a little bit, been nursing the injury. But one thing you mentioned about Victor Wembanyama earlier is that, in a sense, he's positionless because of everything he does. And Scoot's not. Scoot is very clearly a sort of an on-ball engine, in the NBA. And, I'm of the belief that if Pistons get the number 2 pick, you just use consecutive lottery picks on ball handlers, but Scoot might be the best of them, so you still have to do it. But I guess for you, where does Scoot kind of fall on like that tier list, and how do you see the Pistons having to make a decision there when you have a 6'2" guard who would probably be the clear-cut number 2 guy in that class?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I love Scoot. I mean, I love his talent. I mean, from an athletic standpoint, skill set style player reminds me of a Derrick Rose in his prime. And having gotten to know Scoot personally the last couple of years, I mean, very similar to my evaluation of Isaiah Stewart. The way he's wired, the way he's built, the way he approaches every single day in the game. This kid he's just a total killer. I mean, he's going to succeed. I mean, as long as he stays healthy, I mean, he's going to be an extremely good player. As far as the fit with Detroit, it isn't a perfect fit because, I mean, you've already got 2 guys that need the ball in their hands to be effective. I do think it can work. I mean, like I said with Cade, I think Cade's a positionless guy. I mean, he's 6'7" plus. He's got a nice frame. I mean, essentially a 1-2-3 is just a perimeter player. And so, I mean, the idea that you could have Scoot, Jaden Ivey, Cade Cunningham as your 3 perimeter guys is pretty scary to me if you're having a matchup. Like, how do you guard all 3 of them? I think you would need a coach to be sort of creative and put together an interesting offense in different sets to make sure that those guys are being utilized properly. But I probably would take Scoot number 2. I do love Amen Thompson as well. And Amen probably style-wise is a little better of a fit because he's more like Cade in the sense that he's sort of a positionless guy that defends everybody, does stuff on ball, but like is effective. Not being ball dominant. But long story short, Scoot would be my guy at number 2.
I have to ask, Matt, and even though I think I know the answer because I know Pistons fans have talked about it and would consider it, would you even consider trading the number 2 pick for a reasonable trade package? Like, obviously you would trade number 2 for Giannis or something crazy, right? But like, if a team was offering you like, hey man, that's interesting. Like that's fair value. Would you even consider that? I would assume not, right? Because you're looking at a younger prospect on a rookie deal, but would there be a deal to be made for you?
And by
in that
fair
situation?
value, is that like a Bradley Beal type? Like, is that sort of the category of player we're talking about? That would be fair value for a guy like Scoot?
That would be what I would consider, something like that. But now you're adding a older player on a big contract.
It's a really hard question, right? Because I mean, I think there's so many scenarios where I mean, let me frame it like this. I don't believe in players or picks being fully untouchable. I think there's certain players and picks where it's like, what, chances are we're probably not going to get something we want to move on. There's probably a price for everything, right? Yeah, and sure. So, I mean, are the Bucks going to trade Giannis? Yeah, probably not. But like, what if a team gave everything? It's like, you might look at it. I don't know. I mean, so yeah, I think I would consider. I mean, and to the point that we just brought up is, Scoot's not a perfect fit. Maybe let's see how the rest of the season goes, how the pre-draft process goes. Maybe they love Amen Thompson. Maybe they love Brandon Miller or Nick Smith or Cam Whitmore, and they're able to trade number 2 to get a player they think fits them better, and they get some additional assets or players or whatnot. I would keep it on the table. Like, why not? I think everything should be on the table, and you should hear it out. Like, that's essentially Troy's job, is to make sure that he's doing what's in the best interest of the team at all times. And so I think if he says something's totally untouchable, I think he's doing his team a disservice.
So this will lead us into number 3, 4, and 5. So how close are those guys to Scoot? Amin, Asar, Cam, those guys? Because I think that's the trade, right? Like, you trade back from 2 to, let's say, 4. If the Pistons think they can get Amin at 4 because somebody else is going to take Cam Whitmore at 3 or something, how close are those guys? Because I kind of have a tier, like tier 1, tier 2, and then there's a tier 3. But I know there's a lot of people who that tier between Scoot and especially Amin isn't that big.
Yeah, it's not that big for me. And like I said, I'm a huge fan of Scoots, but I love Amen Thompson too. I mean, from his talent on the floor and just getting to know him personally, he's wired a way that will give you confidence that this kid's going to succeed too. I mean, I know there's been some question marks with his outside shooting. I'm one that thinks it's going to be totally fine. He's a worker. He's got his head on straight, and it's not totally broken, even though it doesn't look totally smooth. It's not like he's a bad shooter. I mean, he's hitting shots already, and he's a young guy. And so I think it's relatively close. I do have a men higher than Asar. But I do think it's closer between them two than a lot of analysts think. And then, I mean, right now I've got Brandon Miller after him, Nick Smith, Cam Whitmore. I really like G.G. Jackson, South Carolina. I do think those we're gradually getting into another category. I would probably have Victor in his own category by himself, and Scoot on men in their own, and then into that next tier. If I had to do it right now, obviously we have a lot of time for these players to change our opinions, and then also for me to gather more information on them to kind of come to a conclusive evaluation on each guy. But that's how I see it today.
A man, you watch him play, he kind of just looks like a really big, he's like 6'7", super athletic, a guy who's best with the ball in his hands. How much do you buy into him being more of a utility guy, sort of like a Scotty Barnes, where you could really sort of have him occupy a lot of different roles? I think he's a better athlete than Scotty, but I think a team like the Pistons, where you have Cade, you have Jaden, you have Killian, a man would sort of have to show that he could do some things without the ball as well.
Yeah, I actually do think he's capable of doing that. I mean, I think he could do either, honestly. I think he could be a guy that could be your offensive engine where you're running everything through him, similar to how, Cade's used, where it's like, I mean, is Cade a point guard? I guess. Is Luka Doncic a point guard? I mean, who cares, right? The ball is in their hands, and they're the offensive engine, right? I do think a man's capable of doing that. But I also, the one comp I have for him is a different Scotty, is Scottie Pippen.
Okay.
And that's exactly what Scotty was. Scotty was, jack of all trades, Swiss Army knife, point forward, defends everybody. And, with a men, I mean, and Asar, defensively, these kids have a chance of being so special. They're so athletic, and they got frames. They're already pretty strong. I think they're going to be solid, big-time athletes that kind of do everything. And, their outside shooting, I do think there's some correlation with, how they develop there and how much success they'll have. But I think they're going to be good, even if they become just decent shooters. But, I do think a man can be that utility. I mean, like high-level potential, star potential utility guy.
How elite is the athleticism, Matt? I don't know if you've seen him in person. We've all seen the highlights. I've got to watch a couple games with access I have, but obviously not in person. I think it's hard to always judge athleticism. Jaden came in and was an elite guy, first step speed, as a rookie. Are we talking like top 10, top 5, or top 1% athletes from the Twins?
Oh, I mean, I think they're absolute elite athletes. I mean, some of the best athletes I've ever seen. And, one thing that was interesting, and maybe it was a little bit of lip service, but I'll take it anyway. I was with one of my friends that's with Overtime Elite in their front office, and I was asking different questions about their players. And I said, hey, do you think I'm off that I have a men and Asar, so much closer than everybody else? And I admitted I like a men better. And I was like, what do you think? He's like, here's our take. He's like, we've talked about this as a staff specifically, and we feel that you have them closer because you know them better. We know who has been here, in the gym and seen them in person, and we feel like you've got a better grip because you've been to Atlanta so much. And I found that interesting, and I'm going back in a few weeks, and that's pretty much the main thing I'm watching. I'm just going to watch these two kids of like, I know they're a little bit different. Amen's a little bit more of a point guard, Asar's more of a scorer, but like talent-wise, effectiveness, how big is the gap? Because I'm still not real confident on how far it is.
One guy that I think is really intriguing and is playing his way really into that top 5 conversation pretty firmly is Brandon Miller. And I think on paper he kind of has some similarities to Jabari Smith Jr. last year, just being like a really, really clear-cut sort of shooting, wing or power forward, or however you want to categorize it. Also concerns about what else can they do offensively? Like how much of a dribble drive game can they develop, or just inside the interior in any respect? Where are you on Brandon Miller right now? Because I think, if the Pistons are in that like 4 through 6, 4 through 7 range, he's a guy that I think checks out the boxes for him.
Another guy I really like, and just the one thing I like to point out is I'm very high on the top part of this draft. I think the depth isn't very good, but I mean, going down this list, I know I'm saying I love all these kids. I do love the top part of this draft a lot. Yeah. So I would get more critical if we keep going. But yeah, with Brandon, I've watched him since he was in high school. I was just in Portland over Thanksgiving at the Phil Knight Invitational, and I got a chance to watch him several times. he's interesting. And as far as for the Pistons, style wise, he's probably the best fit of this entire top group. I mean, he's a 6'9" shooting wing. That is, I do think he's got ability to create off the dribble, do some stuff in the mid range. I think the biggest criticism right now, he's not great finishing at the rim, but I think a lot of that is lack of physical strength. But I do think he can add some weight and improve that. I don't think it's ever going to be his bread and butter. But I don't think it's necessarily going to be like a glaring weakness either. And then defensively too, I think that the strength will help him. He's rebounding the ball really well for a guy that's more of a perimeter player, even though he is 6'8", 6'9". But yeah, no, he would be a great addition to the Pistons. I mean, if you missed on that first tier of guys.
Last guy here, Matt, and then we'll let you go. We got to ask about Cam Whitmore out of Villanova. Again, a guy that kind of I think fans are excited about because I think fans see Cade and Jaden and then Stu and Duren, and then so they're always looking for like that 3-man. And I know Cam, I'm interested to see what you think, if he can play the 3, the 4, where he's more natural. But just in general, Cam Whitmore and then kind of his fit with the Pistons if they did end up in that, 4 to 6 range like Omari just said.
Yeah, I like him. I'll admit I don't know him quite as well as these other guys we've talked about. I'm going to see him. I've seen him. I saw him at the USA basketball trials before he joined that team this summer. And I'm going to see him next month at Creighton. Whatever else I saw. I saw McDonald's All-American game too, I think. But anyway, I think Troy will like him. I mean, a lot of the things that Troy said about culture and all that. I mean, he fits the Isaiah Stewart type mold of like he's just a bulldog wing that defends everybody. He's rough and he's tough, but he's got some skill too. I mean, I think he's a natural scorer, shot maker. Sort of. I see him probably more as a 3, but he's just sort of like a positionless guy that's switchable and maybe it's a little bit like a guy that's sort of a master of none kind of thing, but toughness, big, strong frame. I think he's right in that second group that's not too far off the first group.
I'm sorry, I lied. Real quick, I promise. Second round pick, Matt. The right now the Pistons would have number 31. They have their own second rounder after it got traded to like 5 different teams in the NBA. That's how second round picks go. Just give us a couple names, top of the second round, so some guys that would be good talent. If you that are 25 to 40 on your big board, maybe.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of it with the Pistons, it's going to depend on who they take with that first pick, and and again, and sort of what Troy's strategy is. If he's going, with my proposed strategy, again, a guy that probably can play a little bit right away, but has some upside. And let's see who's there. I mean, some guys that I like that have really done well this year that are older college players. Jalen Wilson from Kansas, I think he's been terrific this year. Really tough kid that's versatile. I think he's more of like a stretch 4, but I think he could fit in that role. Terrence Shannon Jr. From Illinois, who transferred from Texas Tech. He's had a great year. And so those are 2 guys that come to mind that have really kind of risen up the ranks. One other guy I'd like to say is Marcus Sasser from Houston. I'm going to go see him at Tulsa this next week. We had him at Damian Lillard's Formula Zero, and he is just a tough sucker. Again, a guy that fits what Troy's trying to do as far as his approach. I mean, defends, shot maker, would be a nice guard off the bench as a backup or even a third point guard type guy.
All right, Matt, thank you. We appreciate your time. Thank you. I've got to know you a little bit more since Summer League. I got to meet you in Denver whenever I went out there for the Pistons game. We got to get brunch together. I appreciate you taking time for me with everything you have going on, helping me grow and do everything. So I wanted to take this time to thank you for that, and I appreciate the relationship we've developed. But let everybody know where they can find you. And I know you can't list everything you do. I don't know how you do it, but let them know where they can find the podcast and all the stuff you got going on.
No, firstly, thanks for all the kind words. It's been a lot of fun, getting to know both of you guys, and I'm always happy to join this podcast. I mean, you guys are one of the best in the business, and I come on as a guest on a lot of these, and this is probably my favorite. You guys are terrific, and
really appreciate that.
As far as where you can find my stuff, so I'm a senior NBA draft analyst for basketballnews.com. So my big board's there, provide some analysis there. I just took a job with Cerebro Sports, which was an analytics company that was recently backed by Mark Cuban. My right-hand man and my protege, Derek Murray, just got hired as head of basketball. He's taken that to a whole nother level. They're turned to a fully fledged scouting operation, and they just hired me as a scouting advisor. So I'll be doing some scouting for them. See, what else do I do? We got my podcast, The Matt Babcock Show, put together by Tidal League, a podcast network. And you can find that on any of the podcast outlets, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Formula Zero, I'm working with Phil Beckner and Damian Lillard for putting together our second annual Formula Zero, which is essentially like a skills camp. We had top 20 high school players and college counselors. We're looking to scale it out, make that better than ever. And I'm a big part of like the player selection process and helping mentor the kids. I think that's just about all I have for now, but it changes every day. I'll let you know what I got to do next time.
No doubt. And we're going to have Matt back on here in a couple months. We're hoping to make this a thing here where he comes in and gives us his perspective and all of his great knowledge. Thank you again, Matt. We appreciate it. Omari, take it away, my guy.
Yeah, once again, Matt, it's been great getting to know you, and always a pleasure to hear your thoughts on the Pistons, just the NBA in general. So definitely excited to have you on here again soon. As for the outro, big thanks to our editor, Carrie Jr. II, and Robin Chan, our executive producer, Anjanette Delgado, and our sports editor, Kirkland Crawford. Also, big shout out to Wes. We'll talk to you all next week.